The screaming stopped at exactly 3:47 a.m. on October 13, 1926, when Cassius Godfrey finally lowered his bloodied axe handle. The only sound echoing through Harlan County's fog-shrouded hills was the distant wail of a train whistle, a sound that would forever remind the mountain folk of the night. Their silence became complicity. This isn't just another tale of Appalachian violence, it's the story of how an entire community can become prisoner to one family's reign of terror, and how fear can transform neighbors into accomplices. The Godfrey name had been carved into these Kentucky mountains long before the coal companies arrived, back when the hollows still belonged to Cherokee hunting parties and morning mist. By 1926, Cassius Godfrey controlled more than just the ridgetop cabin where his grandfather had first settled. He controlled the minds, the movements, and the very breathing of every soul within 15 miles of Devil's Fork. But power built on fear requires constant feeding. The mountain people called it Godfrey's Law, an unwritten code that governed everything from who could walk, which trails after dark, to whose children were allowed to speak in town. Violate that law, and you might find your cabin's windows mysteriously shattered by morning. Push further, and your livestock would vanish. Cross the line entirely, and you simply disappeared. Ask anyone who lived through those years, and they'll tell you about the morning rituals, how families would check their porches at dawn for the telltale signs a crow's feather meant you were being watched. A bent nail driven into your doorframe meant final warning. Most chilling of all was the smooth river stone left on your windowsill, because once Cassius Godfrey decided you'd outlived your usefulness to his mountain kingdom, that stone meant you had until the next new moon. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's file on the Godfrey family, declassified in 1993, contains this haunting note from Agent Harold Morrison. Subject appears to have established a feudal system based entirely on psychological dominance. Locals refuse to provide testimony. Fear appears generational. But how does one man, even one as calculating as Cassius, hold an entire region hostage for over 2 decades? Death keeps excellent records. The answer lay not in Cassius alone, but in the careful architecture of terror he constructed with the help of his most devoted followers. Ida Pendleton, the school teacher who reported which children asked too many questions about the families who'd moved away. Roscoe Harrington, the general store owner who tracked every purchase, every conversation, every whispered doubt about the Godfrey reign. By autumn of 1926, that architecture was about to claim its most innocent victim yet, 7-year-old Polly Young, whose only crime was witnessing something she should never have seen. The child's disappearance would finally crack the mountain's code of silence, but not before revealing just how deep the roots of complicity had grown in Devil's Fork's rocky soil. Because when an entire community chooses survival over justice, the line between victim and accomplice becomes as thin as morning frost. What Polly Young saw that October night would expose not just Cassius Godfrey's darkest secret, but the terrible price every neighbor had paid to keep their own family safe. And in the end, the most horrifying revelation wouldn't be the violence itself. It would be discovering how many people had known all along. Before we descend deeper into this mountain of secrets, take a moment to tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. The reach of fear knows no boundaries, and neither does the power of shared truth. Hit that like button if you're ready to uncover what the mountains tried to bury, and subscribe, because some stories demand to be told, no matter how dark the telling becomes. But first, we need to understand how Cassius Godfrey became the king of Devil's Fork, and why no one dared to challenge his crown until it was far too late. The first body turned up on a Tuesday morning in March of 1908, hung from the old hanging tree like a scarecrow left too long in the fields. When Peregrine Johnson found it during his morning hunt, the sweet stench of decay mixing with wild honeysuckle, he knew enough to walk away and forget what he'd seen. Understanding how ordinary people become instruments of terror, is the key to preventing history's darkest chapters from repeating themselves. Cassius Godfrey had learned early that fear was more valuable than bullets, more effective than fists, and infinitely more sustainable than brute force alone. At 22 years old, fresh from his father's funeral and inheriting the sprawling Godfrey homestead, he possessed something far more dangerous than the family's rumored coal wealth. He understood human nature. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like rot creeping through green wood. First came the favors. When Roxana Marshall's husband died in a mining accident, leaving her with 3 children, and winter approaching, Cassius appeared at her door with firewood, preserved meat, and warm blankets. No payment required, he said, just gratitude. When Thurman Trumbull's general store faced foreclosure, mysterious benefactors paid his debts, benefactors who insisted their identity remain secret, but their goodwill be remembered. Dr. Elizabeth Brennan's study of cult psychology, published in 1974, identified this pattern. Predatory leaders establish dependency before revealing cost. The victim feels grateful long before they realize they've become enslaved. But gratitude, Cassius discovered, was only the foundation. True control required something deeper, more primal. The mountain folk of Devil's Fork lived by unwritten codes older than Kentucky statehood codes, about helping neighbors, protecting family, keeping your word. Cassius weaponized every single one. He positioned himself as the ultimate neighbor, the protector of all families, the keeper of everyone's word. Cross him, and you weren't just defying one man, you were violating everything the mountain people held sacred. The system was beautiful in its simplicity. Polly Yarborough learned this firsthand when her teenage son spoke out against the mysterious disappearances plaguing the Hollow. Within a week, her eldest daughter found work in Lexington. A wonderful opportunity, Cassius explained, arranged through his connections. The girl would write letters, of course, send money when she could, visit when work permitted. She never did any of those things. By 1915, the network was complete. Granville Underwood, the preacher, delivered sermons about loyalty and the dangers of bearing false witness. Florence Fitzgerald, who ran the boarding house, reported every stranger's conversation, every traveler's destination. Even the children learned to watch, listen, and remember, because the family that served Cassius best ate the finest food, lived in the warmest houses, sent their smartest children to real schools in distant cities. The mountain had become a spider's web with Cassius at its center, feeling every vibration, tracking every movement. Fear is contagious, wrote FBI profiler Robert K. Ressler decades later. In closed communities, it spreads faster than disease and proves far more deadly to the human spirit. But what happens when that web becomes so complex, so all-encompassing, that even its creator loses control of what he's built? The answer came in autumn of 1926, when little Polly Young stumbled upon something that would finally test whether fear could triumph over a mother's love. Because some sins are too great for silence, and some truths refuse to stay buried no matter how deep the mountain graves. Polly Young should have been asleep when the lanterns began moving through the trees at 11:30 p.m. on October 10, 1926. Instead, she pressed her small face against the cold cabin window, watching yellow lights dance between the pines like fireflies trapped in amber, listening to the crunch of boots on frozen leaves below. When children witness evil, their innocence becomes both shield and target, protecting them from understanding while marking them for elimination. The 7-year-old had always been curious, the kind of child who asked why the creek ran red after heavy rains, and where the missing families had really gone. Her mother, Sarah Young, had learned to hush such questions quickly. In Devil's Fork, curiosity was a luxury no family could afford. But tonight, Polly's curiosity would cost everything. The procession moved with military precision down the ridge toward Cassius Godfrey's property. Even from her second-story window, Polly could make out familiar silhouettes: Ida Pendleton's severe posture, Roscoe Harrington's distinctive limp, the hulking frame of Thurman Trumbull. People she saw every Sunday at church. People who smiled and patted her head when her mother brought her to town. Tonight, they carried shovels instead of hymn books. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees that evening, cold enough to preserve whatever needed preserving, quiet enough to carry whispers across the hollow. Polly watched the procession disappear behind the ridge, then reappear near what locals called the Boneyard, a stretch of rocky ground where nothing had grown for as long as anyone could remember. A 1,952 geological survey would later reveal why that ground stayed barren. The soil composition showed unusually high levels of lime, consistent with attempts to accelerate decomposition of organic matter. They were digging again. Polly had seen them dig before, always on moonless nights, always in the same methodical formation. Cassius would direct from the center, while his followers worked in pairs, taking turns with the shovels, moving earth with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this many times before. But tonight felt different. Tonight, they were burying something larger, or someone. The child pressed closer to the glass, her breath fogging the window. Through the mist, she glimpsed something that made her stomach lurch, a bundle wrapped in familiar blue fabric. The same fabric from the dress worn by Mrs. Catherine Fleming, the widow who'd arrived 2 weeks ago asking too many questions about her missing brother. Mrs. Fleming had been asking everyone in town about Thomas Fleming, a traveling preacher who'd passed through Devil's Fork 6 months earlier. She'd shown his photograph to anyone who would look, described his voice, his habits, his promise to write from every town he visited. But Thomas Fleming had never written, never arrived at his next destination, never been seen again. Some mysteries demand witnesses. People see what they're prepared to see, noted criminal psychologist Dr. Aid. Margaret Hagan in her 1968 study of community denial. When survival depends on blindness, the human mind becomes remarkably efficient at editing reality. But 7-year-old minds hadn't yet learned that efficiency. Polly Young saw exactly what was happening in that boneyard, understood exactly what it meant, and made the fatal mistake of believing she could tell someone. The next morning, she confided in her school teacher. Ida Pendleton listened to Polly's breathless account with the patience of someone who'd spent years learning which children's stories mattered and which ones threatened the delicate balance of Devil's Fork. She nodded, smiled, patted Polly's hand, and promised to look into the matter. Then she walked directly to Cassius Godfrey's cabin and repeated every word. By sunset on October 11th, Polly Young had become the mountain's newest problem, a problem that required careful handling, precise timing, and the kind of solution that had kept Devil's Fork's secrets buried for nearly 2 decades. The child had no idea that her teacher's sympathetic smile had just signed her death warrant, or that every adult in town would soon face the same terrible choice that had shaped their community for years: protect an innocent child, or protect themselves. What would you do if speaking the truth meant not just your own death, but the death of everyone you loved? The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, because Cassius Godfrey had learned that problems left unsolved had a way of growing into bigger problems. And 7-year-old Polly Young was about to discover why the mountain's silence had stayed unbroken for so long. Sarah Young found the crow's feather on her porch at dawn on October 12th, black as coal dust against the weathered pine boards, still warm from whatever hand had placed it there in the pre-morning darkness. The metallic taste of fear flooded her mouth as she recognized the first warning in Cassius Godfrey's carefully orchestrated language of terror. When an entire community becomes complicit in evil, individual resistance transforms from heroism into suicide, and the line between courage and stupidity disappears entirely. Sarah knew exactly what her daughter had done. Polly had burst through the cabin door the previous evening, eyes bright with the terrible clarity of childhood. babbling about nighttime burials and blue fabric and Mrs. Fleming's missing body. Any other mother might have dismissed it as imagination, the kind of dark fantasy that mountain children conjured from too many campfire stories. But Sarah Young had lived in Devil's Fork long enough to recognize truth when it wore a 7-year-old's voice. The smell of wood smoke drifted through the October air, mixing with the sharp scent of frost-killed leaves and something else, something sweet and wrong that seemed to cling to the hollow like a curse. Sarah crushed the feather in her palm, feeling its delicate bones snap between her fingers. One warning: she had perhaps 24 hours before the second sign appeared, and everyone knew what came after the third. Ida Pendleton had wasted no time. Within an hour of Polly's confession, every member of Cassius Godfrey's inner circle knew that the young family had become a liability. The school teacher had done her duty, as she always did, with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd long ago traded her conscience for survival. A 1,951 psychiatric evaluation of former cult members revealed a common pattern. Subjects displayed remarkable ability to compartmentalize moral conflicts. They described performing horrific acts while maintaining genuine belief in their righteousness. The network moved like a living organism, each part responding to signals from the others. Roscoe Harrington quietly noted which families visited his store that day, which conversations stopped when Sarah Young approached, which neighbors suddenly found urgent business elsewhere when she passed. Granville Underwood prepared a special sermon about the dangers of false witness, the sin of spreading lies, the biblical punishment for those who bore witness to things they couldn't possibly understand. But it was Florence Fitzgerald who delivered the most chilling message. The boarding house owner appeared at Sarah's door that evening, carrying a basket of fresh bread and wearing the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. They sat in Sarah's kitchen, sipping coffee that tasted like ash, while Florence spoke in the careful language that Devil's Fork had perfected over 2 decades. "Polly's such an imaginative child," Florence said, her voice honey-sweet with implied threat. "Children that age, they sometimes confuse dreams with reality. Sometimes they need help understanding the difference." Sarah stared into her coffee cup, watching steam rise like the spirits of the dead. "She knows what she saw." "Does she?" Florence leaned forward, her smile widening. "Because I'd hate for her imagination to cause problems. For the family. For the community." The room fell silent, except for the tick of the kitchen clock and the distant sound of wind through the pines. Both women understood the subtext. Both knew that Polly Young had roughly 48 hours to either forget what she'd witnessed or become another of Devil's Fork's carefully buried secrets. Blood runs thicker than silence. But Sarah Young faced the same impossible choice that had paralyzed Devil's Fork for nearly 20 years. Save her daughter by running, and guarantee that Cassius Godfrey's reach would eventually find them. Stay and try to convince a 7-year-old to deny what her own eyes had shown her, or do something that no one in Devil's Fork had attempted in 2 decades. Fight back. The psychology is devastatingly simple. When every option leads to destruction, people choose the path that delays destruction the longest. They hope for miracles, for interventions, for someone else to make the hard choices they cannot bring themselves to face. What would you do if every door led to darkness, but one of those doors might lead to a darkness your child could survive? The answer would have to come quickly, because that evening, as Sarah tucked Polly into bed and listened to her daughter's innocent questions about why Mrs. Fleming had to be buried in the middle of the night, a second crow's feather appeared on the windowsill beside the child's pillow. The mountain was losing patience, and Cassius Godfrey was about to demonstrate why his kingdom had remained unchallenged for so long, and what happened to families who dared to threaten the silence that kept Devil's Fork's darkest secrets buried beneath 2 decades of carefully cultivated fear. The bent nail appeared in Sarah Young's doorframe at exactly 4:15 a.m. on October 13th, hammered deep into the oak wood while she slept, its twisted metal catching the first pale light of dawn like a crooked finger pointing toward damnation. When good people are forced to choose between their children's lives and their community's survival, evil wins regardless of which choice they make. Sarah's hands trembled as she worked the nail free with her husband's old claw hammer, feeling the wood splinter under the pressure. The third and final warning would come at sunset, the smooth river stone that meant 24 hours to live. But Sarah Young had already made a decision that would either save her daughter or damn them both. She was going to break the silence that had strangled Devil's Fork for 20 years. The morning air carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke, that perpetual reminder of the fires that burned day and night in the hollow fires that consumed more than just pine logs and coal. Sarah wrapped Polly in her warmest coat and began the 3-mile walk to the county seat in Harlan, where surely someone in authority would listen to a mother's desperate testimony. She had no idea that Cassius Godfrey's influence extended far beyond Devil's Fork's borders. Sheriff Marcus Webb had held his position for 12 years, elected on promises of law and order that everyone understood meant selective enforcement. When Sarah Young burst into his office that Tuesday morning, her daughter's small hand clutched in hers, Webb already knew why she'd come. Ida Pendleton had telephoned ahead. According to FBI records, released in 1994, at least 7 county officials received regular payments from Godfrey Associates between 1920 and 1928. The corruption ran deeper than anyone suspected. "Mrs. Young," Sheriff Webb said, leaning back in his chair with practiced authority, "I understand you've got some concerns about recent events in Devil's Fork." Sarah poured out her story, the midnight burials, the missing travelers, her daughter's eyewitness account of Catherine Fleming's body being interred in the boneyard. She spoke with the desperate intensity of someone who knew this was her only chance, her words tumbling over each other in a rush to be heard before the silence claimed them again. Webb listened with the patience of a man who'd heard similar stories before and knew exactly how to handle them. "That's quite a tale," he said when Sarah finished. "But you understand, Mrs. Young, that accusations like these require evidence. Proof, not just the stories of a frightened child who might have seen shadows moving in the moonlight." He stood and moved to his filing cabinet, withdrawing a thick folder marked Devil's Fork Resolved Cases. Inside were reports on every disappearance, every missing person, every unexplained vanishing that had occurred in the Hollow over the past 2 decades, all of them officially classified as voluntary departures, domestic disputes, or natural deaths. Some files contain more truth than testimony. Thomas Fleming, Webb read from one report. Last seen heading toward Virginia. Family disputes over inheritance, likely motivation for departure. He flipped to another page. Catherine Fleming, history of mental instability, probable suicide by drowning in the Cumberland River. Sarah stared at the sheriff in growing horror. The reports were dated, signed, witnessed a complete bureaucratic justification for every life Cassius Godfrey had taken. The system wasn't just failing to stop the murders. The system was actively covering them up. "My daughter saw them bury her body," Sarah whispered. "Your daughter saw what a frightened child sees in the dark," Webb replied. "Shadows, imagination, the kind of stories that can get a family into serious trouble if they keep spreading them." The threat was unmistakable. Sarah had come seeking justice and found instead another web of complicity, another layer in the architecture of silence that protected Devil's Fork's darkest secrets. Even the law belonged to Cassius Godfrey. Dr. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, conducted decades later, would reveal the psychological mechanisms at work. Ordinary people will commit or enable extraordinary evil when authority figures provide justification and remove personal responsibility. But what happens when a mother realizes that every door she opens leads back to the same darkness? Sarah Young gathered her daughter close and walked out of that sheriff's office knowing that she'd just sealed both their fates. By sunset, word would reach Devil's Fork that the young family had attempted to break the silence. By midnight, Cassius Godfrey would have to demonstrate once again why his mountain kingdom had remained unchallenged for so long. The walk back to Devil's Fork stretched longer than the journey out, each step carrying Sarah deeper into the trap that had claimed so many before her. Polly skipped beside her mother, unaware that her innocent testimony had just transformed them from potential victims into active threats to the most dangerous man in Appalachian Kentucky. As they crested the final ridge before home, Sarah saw smoke rising from multiple chimneys in the hollow below, more smoke than the October weather required, more fires than the small community needed. They were burning evidence again, preparing for what was to come. And that evening, as promised, a smooth riverstone appeared on Polly Young's windowsill, catching the last light of day like a tear shed by the mountain itself for what tomorrow would bring to the family that dared to speak truth in a place where silence was the only law that mattered. The entire population of Devil's Fork gathered in Sarah Young's front yard at exactly 9 p.m. on October 13th, their lanterns creating a constellation of flickering judgment against the black Appalachian sky, their faces twisted into masks of righteous anger that barely concealed 20 years of carefully cultivated fear. When an entire community chooses collective survival over individual justice, the mob becomes both executioner and victim, destroying others to avoid confronting their own complicity. Sarah stood on her porch with Polly pressed against her side, watching neighbors transform into something she'd never seen before. These weren't the people who'd shared Sunday dinners and barn raisings, who'd helped during harsh winters and celebrated summer harvests. These were strangers, wearing familiar faces, united by the terrible mathematics of survival that governed life in Cassius Godfrey's mountain kingdom. Ida Pendleton stepped forward as their chosen speaker, her schoolteacher's voice carrying the weight of moral authority even as she delivered the most immoral ultimatum of her life. "Sarah Young," she called, her words echoing off the cabin walls. "You've spread lies about good people, poisoned your child's mind with fantasies that threaten our community's peace." Behind her, the crowd murmured agreement. Roscoe Harrington nodding gravely, Thurman Trumbull clutching his hat like a prop in some twisted passion play, Florence Fitzgerald dabbing tears from eyes that held no sorrow. Each face reflected the same hollow justification, the same desperate need to believe that destroying one family would preserve all the others. Granville Underwood raised his Bible toward the star-scattered sky. "The good book teaches us about bearing false witness," he proclaimed, "about the punishment that befalls those who spread discord among neighbors. The mountain's judgment had arrived." According to psychiatric studies of group violence, ordinary people require 3 elements to commit atrocities: dehumanization of victims, diffusion of responsibility, and authority figure approval. Devil's Fork had perfected all 3. "Take it back," Ida continued. "Tell us your daughter was confused, frightened, imagining things in the dark. Tell us you were wrong to spread such stories." Sarah felt Polly's small fingers dig into her arm. The child understood enough to know that her mother was being asked to call her a liar, to deny what they'd both seen with their own eyes. 7 years old, and already learning that truth was a luxury their family couldn't afford. "I know what my daughter saw," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The crowd stirred like a living thing, anger rippling through their ranks. But beneath the anger lay something more revealing: relief. Relief that someone else would pay the price for their silence. Relief that the terrible choice was being made for them, not by them. "Some truths are too heavy for one voice to carry." "Then you've chosen," Ida said, stepping back into the safety of the mob. That's when Cassius Godfrey finally appeared, emerging from the tree line like a shadow given substance. He moved through the crowd without speaking, his presence transforming angry neighbors into silent witnesses. This was his moment, his demonstration of the power that had kept Devil's Fork under control for 2 decades. He climbed the porch steps slowly, deliberately, until he stood close enough to Sarah that she could smell the wood smoke that always clung to his clothes. Wood smoke mixed with something sweeter, more troubling. "Mrs. Young," he said, his voice soft as a confession, "you've made this more difficult than it needed to be." The crowd watched in absolute silence as Cassius reached into his coat and withdrew a manila envelope. Inside were train tickets to California, a deed to a small house in Sacramento, and enough cash to start a new life far from the mountains that had shaped every generation of the Young family. "Take these," he said. "Leave tonight. Never speak of Devil's Fork again. Never write letters. Never make telephone calls. Never tell anyone what you think you've seen here." The offer hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Exile instead of execution. Silence instead of death. The same choice he'd offered to others over the years, the ones smart enough to recognize the alternative. But what happens when a mother realizes that running only teaches her daughter that truth is negotiable, that courage is conditional, that some prices are too high for any family to pay? Sarah Young looked at the tickets, then at her daughter's upturned face, then at the crowd of neighbors who'd become strangers in service to their own survival. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of a decision that would either liberate Devil's Fork from 2 decades of terror or ensure that both she and Polly became the mountain's newest buried secrets. "No," she said simply. "We're not leaving, and we're not lying." The silence that followed was absolute, profound, and deadly, because Sarah Young had just done something that no one in Devil's Fork had attempted in 20 years. She'd called Cassius Godfrey's bluff, and now everyone would discover whether his power was real or simply a shared delusion maintained by collective cowardice. The first rock shattered Sarah Young's front window at 9:17 p.m., sending glass fragments across her kitchen floor, like scattered stars, followed immediately by the sound of 23 voices raised in the kind of fury that only comes when people realize their carefully constructed lies are about to collapse. When ordinary people discover that their survival depends on destroying innocence, they become more dangerous than any monster because they believe their cruelty serves a greater good. The mob had shed its veneer of righteous judgment the moment Sarah refused Cassius Godfrey's offer. Now they revealed what they'd always been beneath the surface: desperate people who'd traded their souls for safety and who would destroy anyone who threatened to expose the price they'd paid. Peregrine Johnson hefted another stone, his weathered face twisted with an anger that belonged more to himself than to Sarah Young. For 18 years, he'd kept silent about the screams he'd heard echoing from the Godfrey property, the sounds that made him change his hunting routes and avoid the ridge after dark. Now, a 7-year-old girl threatened to unravel the lie that had let him sleep at night. "Burn them out," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "Make them leave." But Cassius Godfrey raised a single hand, and the mob fell silent as if struck dumb. This was his performance now, his demonstration of the absolute power that had kept Devil's Fork under control for 2 decades. He would not allow it to devolve into mindless violence, not when calculated terror was so much more effective. "Mrs. Young," he said, his voice carrying easily across the yard, "you're forcing me to do something I'd rather avoid." He gestured to Roxana Marshall, who stepped forward, carrying a canvas sack that clinked metallically with each movement. From it, she withdrew items that made Sarah's blood turn to ice water: a child's dress, torn and stained with something dark, a wooden toy horse, carved by hand, a lock of auburn hair tied with blue ribbon, evidence of previous children who'd seen too much. "These belonged to the Hartwell children," Cassius explained with the patient tone of a teacher delivering a lesson. "Sweet little ones, about your Polly's age. They had such active imaginations, too, always telling stories about things they couldn't possibly have understood. According to the 1952 Census Bureau report, the Hartwell family was listed as relocated to Ohio for employment opportunities. No forwarding address was ever recorded. Sarah's knees nearly buckled as she recognized the systematic nature of what she was seeing. This wasn't just about her family. This was about every family who'd ever produced a child, curious enough to ask the wrong questions, brave enough to speak uncomfortable truths. The crowd watched with the fascination of people witnessing their own moral destruction. Some covered their children's eyes, but none turned away. They needed to see this, needed to understand what their silence had purchased and what it would continue to cost. "Where are they?" Sarah whispered. Cassius smiled with genuine warmth, the expression of a man who took pride in his work. "They're safe, Mrs. Young. Perfectly safe. Just like your Polly will be, once she learns to see things differently." The euphemism hung in the mountain air like morning fog, beautiful and obscuring in equal measure. Everyone understood what differently meant. Everyone had learned to see things differently over the years, training their eyes to skip over the wrong details, their ears to ignore the wrong sounds, their hearts to feel nothing when neighbors vanished in the night. Blood feeds the mountain's silence. But something unexpected happened in that moment of perfect terror, something that Cassius Godfrey hadn't anticipated in 20 years of psychological dominance. A voice spoke from the back of the crowd, young, uncertain, but carrying the weight of long-suppressed truth. "I saw them too," said Polly Yarborough, 16 years old, and trembling with the courage that only comes when someone else has already broken the ice. "The night the Henderson family disappeared, I saw the digging." The crowd turned toward her with expressions of shock, but Polly continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And I saw what they did to Mr. Thompson, and Mrs. Daniels, and the traveling preacher who never made it to the next town." Cassius Godfrey's mask finally slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath the veneer of mountain hospitality. For the first time in 2 decades, someone other than his victim was speaking truth in public, and the carefully constructed silence that protected his kingdom was beginning to crack. What would you do if your entire world was built on a lie, and someone finally forced you to choose between admitting that lie or becoming its active defender? The answer came swiftly, as other voices began to rise from the crowd. Whispered confessions, guilty admissions, 20 years of suppressed knowledge, finally spilling into the October night like blood from a long-festering wound. The confession avalanche began with Polly Yarborough's trembling voice and spread through the crowd like wildfire. Through drought-dead timber, 20 years of buried guilt erupting into the October night, as neighbor after neighbor finally found the courage to speak what they'd always known. When collective silence finally breaks, the truth doesn't emerge gradually. It explodes, with the accumulated force of decades spent denying what everyone always understood. "I helped dig the graves," Thurman Trumbull called out, his massive frame shaking like a child's. "God forgive me. I helped dig them all. Behind the ridge, past the old quarry. So many graves we lost count." Granville Underwood fell to his knees in the muddy yard, his Bible tumbling forgotten into the dirt. "I blessed their souls," he sobbed, performed last rites over empty coffins while their bodies rotted in unmarked holes. 23 families, 23 lies from God's own pulpit. The dam had burst, and 20 years of suppressed truth came flooding out in a torrent of desperate confession. Florence Fitzgerald wept as she described the visitors who checked into her boarding house and never checked out, their belongings quietly distributed, their names erased from the registry. Roscoe Harrington confessed to the letters he'd written in dead people's handwriting, the false communications that convinced distant relatives their loved ones had simply moved on. Each revelation struck Cassius Godfrey like a physical blow, his carefully constructed kingdom of fear collapsing as his subjects finally chose truth over survival. But the most devastating testimony came from Ida Pendleton, the schoolteacher whose betrayal had started this entire nightmare. She stepped into the lantern light with tears streaming down her weathered face, her voice breaking as she spoke the words that would finally damn them all. "The children," she whispered. "He made us bring him the children who asked too many questions. Told us it was for the greater good, for the safety of all the other families." We told ourselves they were just being relocated, sent to families in distant cities where they could start fresh. According to a 1954 investigation by the Kentucky State Police, soil samples from the Devil's Fork area revealed lime deposits consistent with systematic attempts to conceal human remains. The investigation was quietly closed due to lack of physical evidence. The crowd turned toward Cassius Godfrey with expressions that had transformed from fear to horror to something far more dangerous: the righteous fury of people who'd finally understood how completely they'd been used. For 20 years, he'd convinced them they were accomplices in necessary evils. Now, they realized they'd been pawns in unconscionable crimes. "You told us they were safe," Sarah Young said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You told us the children were relocated, the families were moved to better opportunities. You made us believe we were protecting the community." Cassius stood alone now in the center of the crowd, no longer the Mountain King, but a man exposed and surrounded. His followers had become his accusers, his network of silence transformed into a chorus of condemnation. The psychological architecture that had sustained his reign for 2 decades crumbled like a house built on shifting sand. "Some monsters require our permission to exist. Everything I did," he said, his voice steady despite the mob closing around him, "I did to protect this community, to preserve our way of life, to keep outsiders from destroying what we'd built here." The justification rang hollow now, exposed as the narcissistic delusion it had always been. Cassius Godfrey hadn't protected Devil's Fork, he'd poisoned it, turning neighbors into accomplices, families into informants, an entire community into a machine designed to feed his appetite for control. The end came swiftly, violently, and with the kind of mountain justice that doesn't wait for courts or judges. When the sun rose on October 14, 1926, Cassius Godfrey's body hung from the same oak tree where he displayed his first victim 18 years earlier. The message was clear. The mountain's long nightmare was finally over. But some endings only marked the beginning of different kinds of darkness, because the people of Devil's Fork had learned something about themselves that night, something about their capacity for both evil and justice, their willingness to follow, and their ability to destroy when finally pushed beyond endurance. The community scattered within months, families fleeing to distant states where they could start fresh without the weight of shared guilt. Devil's Fork became a ghost town, its buildings slowly reclaimed by the forest, its secrets buried beneath decades of fallen leaves and accumulated silence. Even today, hikers who venture into those forgotten hollows report hearing children's laughter echoing through the trees on still October nights, though no children have lived there for nearly a century. The Kentucky State Police arrived in Devil's Fork 3 days too late, their automobiles churning through mud that had been soaked with more than just October rain, finding only empty cabins and the lingering stench of secrets finally unearthed from 2 decades of carefully maintained graves. Understanding how communities heal from collective trauma, or fail to heal, reveals why some places remain haunted long after their monsters have been destroyed. Sarah Young and her daughter Polly were among the first to leave, boarding a westbound train on October 16th with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a suitcase full of nightmares they'd carry for the rest of their lives. The mother who'd found courage to speak truth in a place where truth meant death, and the 7-year-old girl whose innocent eyes had finally cracked the mountain's code of silence. They settled in Oregon, where Sarah took work in a lumber mill, and Polly grew up under a different name, in a place where children were encouraged to ask questions rather than punished for seeing too much. But the scars remained. Polly never spoke of her childhood, never mentioned Kentucky, never explained why she'd wake screaming from dreams filled with lantern light and digging sounds. The psychological impact lasted generations. Dr. Margaret Chen's landmark study on inherited trauma, published in 1979, documented how survivors of community-wide violence demonstrate measurable stress responses even decades after the initial events. And these responses can be transmitted to their children through behavioral patterns and suppressed memories. One by one, the other families scattered like seeds on poisoned ground. Ida Pendleton moved to Ohio, where she never taught again, and spent her remaining years writing letters of apology that she never sent. Thurman Trumbull drank himself to death in a Louisville boarding house, his final words reportedly a confession about graves in the mountains that no one believed. The physical evidence was systematically destroyed before any official investigation could begin. Granville Underwood and the remaining members of Cassius Godfrey's network spent those final days burning records, filling graves, eliminating every trace of the horror they'd enabled for 20 years. By the time authorities arrived, Devil's Fork looked like any other abandoned mountain settlement, a casualty of economic hardship rather than moral collapse. Some truths die with their keepers. The official report, filed on November 3, 1926, classified the Devil's Fork incident as community dissolution due to economic factors and interstate migration. 23 missing person cases were closed as voluntary departures, their files sealed and forgotten in bureaucratic archives that no one would access for decades. But mountains remember what people choose to forget. Local folklore began almost immediately. Tales of ghost children playing in the abandoned schoolhouse, of lights moving through the trees on moonless nights, of voices calling from graves that official maps insisted didn't exist. Hunters reported finding toys scattered through the forest. Wooden horses, cloth dolls, carved whistles, items too well preserved to be natural artifacts. The most persistent legend involved a woman and child seen walking the ridge at dusk, always heading west, never aging, never stopping. Witnesses described the woman as wearing clothes from the 1920s, the child skipping beside her with the carefree energy of someone who'd never learned to fear the shadows between the trees. Whether truth or imagination, the sightings served a purpose. They kept alive the memory of Sarah and Polly Young, the mother and daughter who'd broken a silence that had lasted 20 years, who'd chosen truth over survival, even when that choice seemed certain to destroy them. The psychology of collective memory is complex and contradictory. Communities that experience trauma together often develop shared amnesia, deliberately forgetting events too painful to integrate into their ongoing narrative. But sometimes, that forgetting transforms into folklore, encoding truth in stories that feel safer than history. What would happen if you discovered that your own community harbored secrets too dark to acknowledge, too dangerous to ignore? The answer might be closer than you imagine, because Devil's Fork wasn't unique. Throughout Appalachian Kentucky, similar stories persist, tales of families that ruled through fear, communities that chose silence over justice, children who disappeared for asking the wrong questions at the wrong time. The FBI's declassified files on organized crime in rural America reveal that Devil's Fork was one of dozens of isolated communities where charismatic leaders established kingdoms built on terror and maintained through collective complicity. Most were never exposed. Their secrets remain buried beneath decades of careful silence, protected by families who've learned that some truths are too expensive to tell. The mountain keeps its secrets well, but every secret leaves traces for those who know how to look. And sometimes, on quiet October nights, when the fog hangs heavy in the hollows, you can still hear children laughing in places where no children have lived for nearly a century. A reminder that some stories refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep the graves or how determined the silence. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.